Yeah, Devon, my bad. I'll fix that real quick.
Grazie. Also, I'm in the room, but when I try to do audio or like when in video and listen at the same time, it messes up my audio. So I'm going to keep my camera off, but I'll do the reactions thing to let you know when I'm here. But I am here.
Thanks for letting us know. We appreciate it. I just fixed the email chain, and we're ready. Whatever. Fullerton, I haven't heard from you all. Are you here? / ready? Okay. Give me 1 second, y'all. Yeah, for sure. Just let me know. Okay, seems like everyone's ready now. Okay, great. Modern international relations are the projection of the sovereign self to the realm of the nation state alone, and fearful for the potential for anarchy. States engage in the ever-locking dance of alliance, commitment, recommitment, and abandonment. This practice of nation-state IR becomes the gold standard of humanity and civilization, in which all political difference is cast as savagely primitive, either tameable enough for assimilation, exploitation, or wild enough to demand an elimination. King in 17. Near universal acceptance of the legitimacy of the state for a violent settler colony, indigenous populations often transformed to labor for colonial extraction. The underlying motivation to respond to the settler sovereignty view the international system as an anarchic environment where self-interest and national states compete against each other for power. The discipline of IR effectively casts indigenous peoples as primitive sanctions their lands and the forecloses the possibility for certain political communities. More, the denying liberation and force the view of humanity as a set of political states with Europe at the center. Foreign policy actively contributes to the erasure of indigenous political difference conceptually as well as indigenous bodies physically normalizes and affirms settler colonialism. Foreign policy itself is a manifestation of settler colonialism, and this violence turned inward is settler fascism. Physical and ideological fortification of the settler colony produce inevitable micro-fascist violence. Joshik 19. Fascism in the settler colonial states must be thought of as a consequence of logical colonialism. Microfascism are produced in and around institutions of state violence. Anti-fascist movements that leave the settler state outside of reach, leaving themselves vulnerable to settler nationalism. Anti-fascism should not simply be opposed to settler colonialism, but is turned away from settler state and towards indigenous institution values and ethics and many indigenous understand land as a teacher instead of viewing land as terminalius, linking humans, non-humans together in the absence of coercion, hierarchy, or authoritarian power. Instead, forming relationships based on these representative respect, non-interference, self-determination, and freedom. Indigenous researchers offer alternatives to colonial and fascist conception of people, land, and more than human world. The imagining a future without fascism that does not involve indigenous resurgence or reaffirm settler futurity, grounded normativity teaches how to live our lives in relation to other people and non-human life forms in profoundly non-authoritarian, non-dominating, non-exploitative manner. Grounded normativity even involves following the lead not just of indigenous peoples in the imagined monolithic group, but rather specific indigenous nations, peoples, tribes, and that live and have lived on the lands we find ourselves in. Not only just as Vegas accountable to addressing the injustice settler colonialism itself, it is the only way to attack fascism's roots, which are deeply entwined with settler society. Fascism and settler colonialism form place-based decolonial anti-fascist action, and this settler fascism requires the death of Native and Black life in order to secure its material and symbolic coordinates. The ultimate horizons of the settler polity can only ever slow down the creep of fascism in different forms. Robinson, 17. Left-wing neo-fascism in some form, particularly of virulent authoritarian nationalism, settler colonialism, the traditional formulation definition of fascism are insufficient. Fascism, imperial suppression turned inward, but anti-fascist theory and practice must continue in settler colonialism and symbolic political, social and political orders, literal material meaning of the land as well as regular, less regular meanings of physical, political, social, cultural, ideological, and economic fields soaked in blood of Native and Black peoples. Fascism in the Northern Black can only occur in the context always already defined by two fundamental axes: Native elimination and anti-Black violence. These two axes, while being somewhat incommensurable, also overlap. The second material life of white settler colonial society is structured together by anti-Black and anti-Native and anti-Black solidarity. Settler colonialism is the fundamental drive towards the elimination of Native peoples. These processes are daily reinforced within the symbolic coding Native life under settler colonialism. You see it defined through factors of death, the grammars of suffering of Native life clearing and civilization not only destroyed Native bodies, but also evacuating Native sovereignty from the spatial coordinates. The condiment from settler temporality. The Native is made into feral savage flesh. The ontological ordering settler world was never sovereign and has no possibility of ever being sovereign. Transposed into Native from their body onto the settler. The grammars of civilization held out the Indian minds and values and places them on the prerogative of the settler Black. This is equated with inherent status of enslavability and criminality and is marked for permanent exclusion of the social fold. The underlying logic has remained what fascist violence means to us when we already live on grievable conditions. We should not ignore the potential for violence and excessive settler colonial operating. Foundational anti-Native and anti-Black violence of the political process sustained through the Black settler colonialism has always articulated a war over life and death with two fundamental aims: the elimination, dispossession of Native people, and subjugation, violence, exclusion of Black people's liberalism, and fascism. The contours in the Northern Bloc can only be properly placed on the same ethno-political continuum rooted in Native and Black death with the colonial state as liberal or fascist. The fundamental warfare remains at the best. The choice lies between a slow democratic and fascist colonialism, anti-fascist theory and practice with an explicitly communist perspective, and able to offer solution because Native and Black ghosts both living in dead haunts. Possibility of socialism, settler colonialism can only result in its own reconfiguration of arrangements of settler power into a new form. We cannot choose between democratic colonialism and fascist colonialism because the ultimate problem is the same: colonialism. And the only viable response is an anarcho-indigenous rejection of alliances, non-participation in the institutions which structure the colonial relationship as a necessary condition for political activity. Paulette, 16. Anarcho-indigenism, organized critique of state capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy that would find an incarnation of rejection of alliances, non-participation in the institutions that structure the colonial relations, direct action, physical resistance, and confrontation with state power. A place-based repressive rejection of modern treaty process. Anarcho-indigenism refers to an ideal that remains to be materialized, and our reconfiguration of international relations is one that challenges the nation state as a defined political actor in Western IR for the autonomous agencies of collective personhood is the necessary condition for any negotiation of politics or power. Lasky, 11. Colonialism, imperialism continue to be deeply implicated in conflicts, critique power relations of Westphalian system of nation state sovereignty, privileges, constitute ideological and discouraging practices, gender structures, and hierarchies. Indigenism reflects creative linkages between place-based struggles and transnational networks and activism, self-determination, reconfiguring international relations, challenging neo-colonial hierarchies within the state and interstate system. The self-autonomous sovereign man or nation demarcated by political Western political science, non-hierarchical unsettling of state authorities, autonomous agencies of collective personhood reveal possibilities for more than just negotiations of tensions in alignment with the realities of our shared world. Power circulates multifarianism, and intersubjectivities that are produced, reproduced, and continually contested in governmentalities of our time, and prioritize an analysis of relations at the expense of nations. Western political science's dogmatic appeals to the discrete nation state is a bulwark of colonial desire, which disavows the violent operation of genocidal power internally in order to secure the power projection of imperial power externally. Lasky, 11. Anarcho-indigenism is relational, grounded in the earth. Western political science has been premised on their nation as rational and realizable and unimaginable death and irrational devastation. What if we were focused on the relations and not the national part of international relations? Sovereignty emerges through the discursive production of a new framework to deal with encounter Indians that are included within this system only be disciplined. Indigenous anarchy was constructed as threat quelling. The threat became the impetus for imperialism and finally colonialism. The interlocking pressures of capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, racism continue to function as means of inward consolidation of nation states, and our grounded relationality is mutually exclusive of the proprietary logic of settler colonialism. Exceptionalizing human activity requires the inevitable reproduction of genocide and slavery. Bernardell, 18. Grounded relationality, situation in relation to and from the land, living relationalities, which is non-human world, the material land, having the same capacities as seed, the work concept of the human relationality when land is understood not as property, but as a source of relation with agency. In itself, there's an ontological condition for a different concept of political that refuses conquest. Can land as a source of relation rather than the site of boundaries, redefine a politics on which indigenous sovereignty and black preparation movement can rebuild capacity for relationality rather than to accessivity or inclusion. Liberal freedom, failure, heart, expropriation of collective life mode refuses to compare and oppose black and native dispossession. Instead, offers a way to conceive of debt as disownership. Settler colonialism became a kind of counter-rule, decentralized bodies as a site of pure labor. Those struggling against colonialism must turn away from the colonial state and find transformative practices that uphold the relations of reciprocity to shape our engagement with the human and non-human world. The land-grounded normativity provides an ethical way of knowing that and being that is more expansive than the ontology prioritizing the human as exceptional. Indigenous intervention reorient knowledge and power within and through. Indigenous returns to land. Lost land is dodged. Lost sovereignty is lost. Relationships with land itself activates, fosters, and nourishes. And this form of agency undermines dominant spatial relations that produce violence. Relational understanding of land politics are means of resistance. Settler fascist conditions also produce the erasure of black spatial relations that are the basis for collective organizing. For example, the Black Land Project reasserts non-sovereign relations to the land. Tuck and Gas 17. Settler colonialism was to reduce human relationships to land, to property, a vehicle to attaining civil rights, accompanied by the remaking of African persons into property. To be made into property, black peoples must be kept landless and life settler communities. Black geography, certainly material, can be lived in unusual and unexpected ways. Imagine possibilities, leaving room for interpretation. Geography, settler colonialism is rooted in non-blackness, thus in validating discovery cartographic needs, expression to acknowledge the legacy of racial dispossession under right space and place, and the connections between what are considered real ownership and betrayed through racial codes that mark the body as ungeographic discourses of making property and ownership are central to hegemonic relations of settler colonialism and anti-blackness. And space and place give black life meaning in a world where blackness is deemed ungeographic. This debate is a space where we can have these contextual conversations that reveal commonality and shared visions of the future. Tuck et al. 14. The Black Land Project formed to analyze stories about the relation between black people, land, and place, space, and place give black lives meaning in a world that has deemed black populations through intended geographies as ungeographic. The falseness with blackness is ungeographic, seen only in human terms. The production of black spaces is tied to the locations that are explicitly produced in the objective of the races of captivity and economic profit. Colonial geographies required black displacement and placelessness. Black people have always experienced occupied and constructed place a priority. Project just to recognize that black geographies has been constructed in spite of landscapes of domination, that black imaginations and mappings are evidence of struggle over social space. Black people are telling stories of personal geographies have identified significant variations in relationship with their land. The idea of black people's relationship with land is ungeographic, often presumes oversimplified relationships. There is a single history of blackness. Having the space to think and be able to name these feelings of confusion brings her closer to her own history and visions for the future. Sense of longing to create a articulated geographic narrative that encompasses both and emotional space. Examining these geographies places us on the threshold of a new ways of understanding relationships to land. Black lives are always already geographic, being located in and experience belonging in specific places irrespective of attempts at displacement, migration, or relocation. Cross 6.
You're good?
Yeah.
All right. What happens if the judges vote negative? Like, is that being complicit in structures of violence?
I mean, the debate hasn't happened yet. I don't know what they would be voting negative for. Our argument is the F is a good idea in its relationship to the world. We think the F is good, which means that doing the F is good.
All right, sure. Why or are black people human?
Our argument is that the status quo attempts to sort of strip humanity from blackness in a variety of ways that our Robinson evidence describes as a sort of as a descriptive statement. We think that we should desire possibilities of changing the answer to the question that I gave at the beginning.
What does that mean? So, like,
we should change
So, should black people be human?
We should shift the notions of humanity that produce anti-black violence. So our argument is that humanity in the status quo is sort of generated as a comparison to black and native people. Our argument is that the F is a ways in which we can sort of end the world as such that generates that notion of the human.
All right. So what does that mean? Like, what does it look like to point to the human outside of Western modernity?
So a couple of things. First, we think that grounded relationality understands the human not as exceptional, but rather just one mode of being in the world. Our relationship to land, not as object or property, but rather a relation with an agency, necessarily shifts the terrain of the human that that Western man, as you describe it, is able to sort of compare itself against. So we think that that's the sort of primary sort of vector. We also think that the material strategies of Anarcho-indigenism are good ways of challenging the political constitution of man as such.
Okay. If the judges vote F, does that resolve the impacts of the 1AC?
Our argument is that the F and grounded relationality are a sort of generative process in debate. So we think that it solves that part of it. We obviously don't think that like literally all violence goes away or anything like that.
How do the judges determine if relations are good or bad,
The debate?
or just
So-
relationality? Like, how do you
I
determine
guess I don't
whether it's a good
understand.
form of relationality?
I mean, it's obviously like pretty contextual, but our argument is that good forms of relationality are non-dominating, non-authoritarian, rely on reciprocity and self-determination. Those are all things our Bird evidence lists as things that are good forms of relation that grounded relationality produces. So we think that those are relatively sort of universalizable to other kinds of relations to determine whether or not they're good. So for example, the relation that the US has to native nations is bad because it's a dominating and authoritarian one.
Okay, does that mean that the AF only defends those like good notions of relationality, not all of relationality writ large?
The AF thinks that the relationality that we produce and we defend are good. So like, I don't know what you mean by relationality writ large.
That's fine.
When it's sent, it's a 1 and then the case.
I'm so sorry, Jared. You said 1 in the case?
Yep.
Okay, sweet. Thank you. Then I'm good.
I'm also good.
Kenny, Devon, Will. Cool. Time is terror, the one you see situates with a temporal economy, promising hope in some remediated future. The space becomes reparative. It is left wanting in the moment. The face of temporal homelessness of blackness, deprived of meaning, and contrast itself with the slave embodies black time, the abyss of temporality, absent duration, the absent refusal to content with the fracturing, intrinsic to the epithermalization of time itself. Is the refusal of blackness worn in 16. Slavery is the externality of any blackness, imposing metaphysical temporality on the African body, particular colonization through a particular colonization of time through the black body, the metaphysical horde, the middle passage, which separated the world we're living in, that of dead compounds of the ontological dimension, without a future, without an accessible past. In the present, overwhelming human time is the production and semiotics of meaning. The structuring of the self is also accompanying through the time of man. Black time scholars tend to reduce the event horizon of slavery to a metaphysical object, to conquer it, to get over it. The instant desire to gain distance from the object, and animates their refusal. The one you see mystifies structural anti-blackness. Their discussion of 1950s global decolonization movement that's all to decolonize themselves by creating their own archives in order to shift the symbolic values, cannot create new records now through different relations of power. The affirmative is unable to shift the knowledge and value system in order to transform institutions. The record of memory of slavery should structure all approaches to changing social perception and relationality. The AF assumes pondering on other kinetic and oral traditions within marginalized communities that can change metaphysics or change time and history. Wilderson says that that the slave is not on the map of language, tradition, and history cannot be catalyzed in order to radicalize a memory that never existed, which is exactly why we must theorize the aphasia, the way that communities restructure historical based on colonial traditions and relationality. The affirmative assumes that there's no way self-governance can be taken and used in a context removed from the people, but perform that exact violent reification. The Garba and Sorrentino in 20. Frankly, the settler native triad through settler colonialism, concentrated with labor theory, a slavery slave position can never reproach land, enables a meaningful struggle and recovery, unable to be enslaved. Indigenous peoples have protection against the threat of their struggle being turned into an empty signifier. Slavery is resistance to recovery. The problem at the core of slavery that lack anything of lack indigeneity expresses in relationality, not possession. Slavery might always already condition land. Slavery cannot be added. Theorizing the non-economic utility of the slave operates as the blackness blackness is unsolved. The humanity and the aspeciality slave is abstract. It is the black feminist project of Horton Spiller. Sticks themselves by break by bones, but words will most certainly kill us. The affirmative pluralism is a model of whose resilience on difference in unity collapses difference under presumptive totality. The affirmative theory of racial violence engulfs slavery by assuming decolonization can secure subjectivity for the slave. Slavery mediates the ethical and political commitment to refusal as a prior question to indigenous activism. Garba and Sorrentino in 20. Coherence has become a resource for indigenous activists. Idle no more, no dapple, though engulfs slavery by having decolonization standing simultaneously invokes the subsumed scholars such as Winter De Silva. The Black Land Project, employed alongside settler colonialism, seen as derivative rather than essential. The slave is transubstantiated into either colonizer or proto-settler position. The roots of analogy, they fold slavery to mediate the dissimilarity between the slave and the native, imbuing them with a positive substance. The object is undermined by physical commitments that divide the material form of symbolic space and from its symbols. This object orientation pulls slavery into its orbit and subsume it. The affirmative in its reading of mutual defense right produces a sympathetic reading of sovereignty. This misunderstands the logic of indigeneity for native people can be named and its recovery pursued, but the extent to the black struggles would require enslaved Africans to demonstrate the spiritual worldview, land informed for practices of kingship structures. That this is solidarity based on cultural similarities that requires re-indigenization, which ignores de-racialization. It ignores that the loss of indigeneity for blacks can be acknowledged only by abstractly and because and that something else must always stand in for the recovery, which turns the aft because they ignore the landless blacks who do not have baseless politics towards the land, which they can't ignore through the black anarchical tradition and slavery that will pursue the end of the world, not as indigenous people and their migrant allies, but using slavery as a precondition for genuine resistance to civil society. Sexton in 16. Community color driven by anxiety, struggle for abolition, decolonization, slavery is reduced to a coherent migration and forced slavery, a liberal narrative of emancipation immune to black radicalism, a systematic reading of sovereignty linking the Americas to Africa and Asia, the Pacific Islands, a reassertion of internally differentiated indigenous life, world decolonization, removing the colonizer from the territory. It holds open the possibility of neocolonial, landed resources, sovereignty, decolonial forms of life, decolonization pursues liberation as indigenous researches any progressive relations with non-black populations fail to disrupt the prior settled colonial situation, serves to entrench its power. Presenting diverse views is a way of African Americans to transform themselves into settlers, into allies in solidarity. The demand for black people to adopt indigenous ontology, to speak on indigenous term without the context of sovereignty, leave the colonizer intact, and rely upon continued existence for matters of recognition and redistribution. The land where native sovereignty is a precondition for black native solidarity upon black people's willingness to provide support the indigenous movement, the support to the indigenous movement. Frequent reference to shared struggle, strategic alliance, and convention alongside acknowledgement of history, Indian slavery, ongoing exclusion of black and native people, the perversive anti-black racism, even where there is no denial, even if there's a native anti-black racism, recognize the struggles of black native people affirmed as an argument forwarded to solidarity, seeking to reunite with allies enslaved Africans who demonstrated a spiritual worldview, land informed practices, kinship structures, political solidarity derived from the cultural similarities. There, the alternative lodges a radical demand to inhibit the radical groundlessness of unsovereignty in order to disrupt the ontological basis of anti-blackness, the affirmative, and its accompanying of settler colonial ambitions. This requires the rejecting the affirmative in order to push their demand of recognition into disillusion. This radicalizes the affirmative project at the very point where it no longer recognizable to itself. Sexton and 16. An endeavor that teaches us through pedagogical instruction and exemplary transmission. The study of slavery is already the study of capitalism, colonialism, settler colonialism. Abolition is already the struggle for communism, decolonization, settler decolonization. Slavery is the threshold of the political world. Abolition is the interminable radicalization of every radical movement. The modern world owes its very existence to slavery. Abolition is the uprooting of the nation, and the notion. A politics without claim, without the demand, or whose demand is too radical to be formulated in advance. What is the real problem of sovereignty as such? Abolition consists of the affirmation of the unsovereign slave, the effectual, the derelict, monstrous wretch, figures altogether different from the colonized natives. Go to the case page. The affirmatives multicultural movement just fosters white supremacy of the left. Their organizing will result in black bodies as fungible to their own ends as a king. And 4. The presence of people of color in anti-war and other so-called global justice protest marches led by organized people, whites legitimize tactics that undermine true pursuit for justice. As soon as we approach the sea of white folks, they become aware of our presence. As we became as a sideshow, white people started to clap and cheer as if they were long-awaited people of color, parade and float. They could awe at the point. As soon as members of the contingency started to pick up other bullhorns and speak white supremacist imperialism that murdered people of color, they became offended. All our presence only legitimized the work of whites, which is to say that positions in power and control discourse, action, in direction so-called progressive politics. There's a black femphobia just add to their form of organizing. It's dangerous for black women. Johnson and 9 white communist workers that had a special responsibility to support black women's autonomous struggles, because inevitably resisted race, class, and gender exploitation, and thereby took aim against the capitalist system. Neither Marx nor Lenin had the historical context in which to argue the gender black subject dilemma of the gender black worker who were doubtly exploited. The concept of super exploitation regarding black working class black women were oppressed at the same of the whole population. exploitation. Black women were not undoubtedly but triply oppressed. If one black woman were not allowed to join trade union, participate in organized labor movement, labor organizations, skewed the domestic, and thus co-sign black women into victimhood and exclusion, thus continuing the super exploitation. Black women were restricted by types of work to engage in this. It was more difficult to confront inequalities within the Communist Party. Jones became a liability. She was no longer useful and had to be eliminated. Though both address the plight of working class, they leave the void as true identity of the working class. Mark at working class. You should be inherently skeptical of their responses. Their epistemic claims are levied on the ontological vantage point of sovereignty, which can only reproduce a post-racial human of voting negative as a process of systematic reading of radicalizes decolonial practice by making it lose touch with itself. Sexton and 16. I am due the intervention of indigenous scholars to discern a concept of racial slavery that is truncated account of historical information, illusion of slaveholding, anti-blackness among native peoples, in which Indian slavery ignored and anti-blackness is conflated with colonial white supremacy, a liberal political narrative immune to the history of black radicalism, in which postbellum civil rights is mistaken freedom and misidentification of black incubation under the colonial heading. In fact, in the fact of blackness is avowed by the racism, colonialism, and displaced by land contests that these elements draw from and contribute to post-racialism. Their faith in performativity as an act of emancipation does nothing in the face of gratuitous violence. Wilderson and 10. Cultural studies insists on government suffering, which assumes that they're well positioned by the symbolic order. Speechlessness in the face of gratuitous violence. Theoretical of aphasia if everyone does not possess at the time and just space to transform to capacity, relational status, and other humans through which a capacity is recognized or and incorporated. The last Wilderson card at incorporated.
Okay. Ready?
Yeah, let me get some water real quick. Hold on. All right, I'm good.
Okay. The Black Femphobia dissad is about white communist movements of the past. What about that? It describes the AFS model of organizing.
We think that black women kind of face this super exploitation that the Jones evidence is talking about, or the Johnson evidence is talking about. It's Claudia Jones is an example of that. We think that the way that the AF kind of gets exported cannot resolve those things.
How? Like,
what we don't. The AF gets exported. Well, we don't think that the AF has a metric to resolve those things. Like, we think those forms of relationality that were always trying to be produced by things like the Communist Party were also very fucked up to black women.
Sure. The last piece of evidence you read, the Wilderson evidence, is about sort of performativity and cultural studies. Again, what about this as the F?
Sure. Vaughn, you want to take this one?
Yeah, we'll argue that like the AF's gesturing towards a grounded relationality is a performance of how people can relate to one another, which sort of links into what Wilderson's talking about, assuming that like performing relations can like overcome violence and give us agency when gratuitous violence isn't able to be like overcame by notions of agency and performance.
So I guess all of those answers sort of pose, I think, a larger question, which is what kinds of relationality are possible between non-black people and black people?
Well, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, like none. Our argument is that
None.
like
Okay.
the capacity for relationality isn't possible for the black being.
So what is your response then to moments that seem like relation? So the stuff of like wherein sort of Native and Black people have sort of the particular conversations and produce particular movements, what is happening there if not relationality?
Well, that's the thing. Both of the Garba and Sorrentino evidence kind of get at the way that kind of movements of decolonization have only resulted in violence or creates rules of analogy. The Garba and Sorrentino evidence both cite No Dapple and I Don't Know More as examples of why that is true.
Sure. What I guess what defines the rubric of sovereignty?
Vaughn?
The rubric of sovereignty, like having power over a certain place.
Power over a certain place. Okay. What about that? So is there any kind of sovereignty that you think could ever be good?
No, like our argument is that we should start from a frame of like unsovereignty.
What does the alternative do about the settler colonial state as it is currently?
The alternative is a rejection of the affirmative. It says that the starting analytic of slavery is better to address the structural antagonism because slavery exceeds like land-based politics, and absent starting from there, we're only going to replicate modes of anti-blackness in coalition building that the ones you're going to cite like in the tweets.
Okay, thanks. We'll take prep.
Well, it'll be the F, then the critique. We have. How do I? All right, there. All right. Sorry, I couldn't see like the non-video participants, so I don't. Just like a thumbs up or anything when y'all are ready. All right, for sure. Everyone looks good. I need 3 more minutes on my timer. There we go. All right, is everyone good? Looks like it. Let's go. Each try or die for relations outside of anti-black settler hierarchies, alliance relations via nation states are to effectuate genocidal anti-black violence across the globe as the projection of the settler sovereign self. The settler colony attempts to liquidate all remnants of indigeneity, broader transfer settled subjectivity across the globe. To maintain this international scheme, the settler colony must turn violence inward in the form of fascism to legitimize its own subjecthood. The impact of fascism producing black and native death as a means for its existence driven by white resentment and the thirst for new frontiers to settle. This is offense for the permutation. Anti-fascist practices must contend with settler colonialism structuring into social and political, which the alternative does not, because the violence of fascism is brought home from the exceptional state of expansion on the frontier, the clearing and civilizing indigenous people to mark the land right for settlement in the carceral continuum that mark the black experience on this land, along with the clearing of the contingent, the clearing of the continent of indigenous people. Blackness is equated with an inherent status of enslavability and criminality marked for permanent exclusion from the social fold as the black body itself becomes a site of accumulation. Settler colonialism isn't just about indigeneity; it also produces the erasure of black spatial relations that are the basis for collective black organizing. So a decolonial framework for action disrupts human exceptionalism in the spatial boundaries that separate indigenous critique from black organization by demonstrating how black bodies become a site of spatial accumulation. And anarcho-indigenism is found in critique of settler colonialism and white supremacy by forging alliances among native and black resistance via ground relation, which allow for local and intentionally rooted strategies for resisting outside of genocidal anti-black institutions, bringing about change through direct actions, physical resistance, and confrontation with state power. That's all, and that benefits of the permutations. I'll give more examples when I get down to that debate. But ground relationality allows for the land to foster those lost relationships served by settler colonialism, property relations, generating the reliance and needed for resistance to anti-black settlement, which the authors would agree is really good. Now on the case line, there can go 4 arguments. There are 3 arguments. First is that this is about anti-war arguments of Bush, and that's just not the F. Second is that fascism is the root cause for all of the violence that King articulated, which means that if we can prove that we resolve fascism, then you should feel comfortable voting affirmative. Third is that ground relationality solves specifically the last line of it, because it talks about how white modes of governance are still existing, but having ground relation and generating strategies against those forms of politics are good, and we do that. And the black femphobia just said, 1, we aren't communists, and only one of us is white. This isn't a link to the 1AC whatsoever, but a link to leftist organizing that's extremely white, and that's just not the affirmative. And second, spatiality is a root cause spatiality is a root cause to the viewing root cause to making the black women fungible and accumulation solves it, because it's the last that's the last part in the 1AC. The Tuck evidence resolves this debate. And now their post-humanism Sexton argument. First, we aren't post-humanism, and second, the Robinson evidence answers, and I'll do more of that on the sovereignty debate when I get to the critique. And their Wilderson evidence, this isn't us because we aren't cultural studies, and conflating us as such is really anti-indigenous. It just assumes that our mind essentializes all resistance. Besides, the 1NCs in relation is the only way to effectively combat violence, which means that if we win the relation is good, then we win that debate. Let's go to the critique. Role of the ballot should be to vote for the team that produces the best strategies to combat structural violence. They need to have a practice for resolving their impacts. Grounded relationality is a better model of resistance. If we win that they're theorizing a blackness is exceptional, rather then you can't vote for the alternative. Settler colonialism isn't just about indigeneity. It also produces the erasure of black spatial relations, which means we should get a perm, do the F, and non-mutually exclusive parts of the alternative, because contingent collaboration solves all the disas. Grounded relationality doesn't require an ancestral attachment to land, but uses the land as a foundation to generate new forms of relationality. This fosters contingent collaboration amongst black and indigenous people that rupture settler geographies and generates more contextual strategies for resistance than the alternative. alternative that's tugging all at 14. The collective theorizing about land in place of performative contingent collaboration designed to move forward and separate efforts to theorize black and indigenous relations to land in a way that would be mutually informative, constructive collaboration, provided counterpoint how others theorize solidarity and require an ethical incompatibility, recognize the distinction between various parts of the partnership between BLP researchers and the researchers of this new policies an example of contingent collaboration because what we individuals seek opposition or contrary forms of justice, but rather than a partnership and contingent collaboration because the colonial American contingent collaboration puts the ways that thresholds are simply places across the form of state and they're the places demand a pause and mark that passion demand such places are necessary for ethical integrity of the collaboration between BLP researchers and Sunni new policy research that include a conscious examination of the logical and ethical premises by these social sciences have seemed to offer, and intercommunal violence is solved by the contingent collaboration arguments by recognizing incommensurable demands and mediating within the impasse provides generative work to have those conversations and resolve most of the offense and provide better coalition potential. And there are examples that we need to articulate struggles over the meaning and place at geographic dimensions to the practice of black reclamation. The example is walking the land and having conversations about particular attachments to the places that we cross, understanding black spatial relations and how they severed a relation to that land, understand how indigenous clearing paved the way for black oppression. Our evidence points to things like collaborating on the destruction of property ownership relations to begin working with and through land instead of collaborating on land. This shift in organization is due no justification for the permutation because the alternative lacks the capacity to materialize action outside of settler geographies tending to the land is a good example. Urban gardening provides a unique reparative relations that sutures the disparities between blackness and land. Those relationships have always existed and the negative doesn't want to recover them. Make them name more examples than no depot and more. There's more to decolonization than that. And grounded relationality isn't bound to sovereignty-based notions of landedness. Refuse the totalizing frame of blackness as placelessness. This is a misreading in terms of the alternative's capacity to resolve their impact. Only the permutation allows us to live ethically with each other. That's Zellers in 21. The complexity of black life through beyond Turtle Island brought by settling and black people's relationship with their articulate offers a refusal of convenient orthodox epistemic frames in the ongoing study of black people and settler of saints, spiritual science and the wild mushroom movements, black life beyond the break, more tender relationality based more than human existence. Black comes the inability to couple as an anti-black logic produced by settler and relations. The rewards are twofold. First, the undeserved bounty of the gift, and second, the offer that place will my future wars of black comes with negative ground of normativity, capture the ethical engagement that former understands and the right one had to go about resolving conflict and how to be best relate to the world and each other in a healthy, sustainable manner. Studies of mediation of black land relationality and an ongoing set of practices that guide black land relationality, a set of practices that in order to respond to harm and violence non-punitively, normativity reproduces the practices that are inherently informed by intimate relationships to place for it to study and wild mushrooms and to move every counter in the technology that fosters black dehumanization, native ownership of black people and the genocide, native peoples to new world also suppose opportunity infection something new is embodied a different way of being on and with the land and to live a life in relation to other people and non-human life forms with profoundly non-authoritarian, non-dominating, non-exploitative manner. And 1 AC Robinson link turns the critique and justifies the permutation because it explains that the two fundamental axes of fascism being native elimination and anti-black violence, those two axes while being somewhat incommensurable with one another also overlap, which means that we have to analyze those relations. I've already done the work explaining why the effort resolves at least some of the critique's impact, which makes the perm justified. They construct blackness and nativity as exceptional or exclusive theories of power and commits to a white settler master logic of self-possession, which desires to render the world entirely noble and categorical. That's a better difference from the one I see. Their exceptionalist reading of sovereignty misidentifies the sovereign possibility of the native from the settler master perspective. The native is void and there is no possibility of humanity, which answers the Warren evidence, Sorrentino evidence, and turns to Stetson evidence. That's Robert in 20. The white settler master occupies the space of the human and the black settler, the abject and non-human between these two positions. The native savage which Fullerton occupies the liminal position, the half-human is a reason in the half-human possibility of exceptionality, and the native savage Fullerton is found with an understanding of remembrance and native life, genocide, and loss of sovereignty, loss of sovereignty is able to reincorporate and make legible with the humans registered to the structural readjustment. Fullerton compartment laws of the round ontological position, declaring genocide and loss of sovereignty, ultimately failing to recognize that ensure red life is an addition for being clear and priority exists. And native sovereignty exists at colonial time, which is safe but not exist at all in order to be dismissed paradoxically. Native sovereignty is a creation of discovering the notion native sovereignty is a void non-native American emerged from bar from sovereignty is ontological, can only be regarded as a non-human occupants as far as the settlers from the Red Indian never had sovereignty. The chapter Fullerton felt in the discussion of the loss of native sovereignty, the respective madness and never encroached the pacific cargo of coherence is the thing it's on native sovereignty. It's not there, but the same thing as sovereignty is the white settler master. Any future that preserves settler colonialism with its civil society government ontological symbol forms of one its very constitution voids any notion of native self-determination. The native called the native is not and never has been a sovereign. We must first recognize that we have been and always have been determined by and through the prerogative of the settler. There is no possibility of structural readjustment, only relationship of a priori and antagonism. The native can indeed never truly be as long as the world of the settler continues to be in perm. Do both. This debate should be a momentary suspension of exceptionalism. This avoids reducing colonization to racialization in the reverse. Only misguided exceptionalism prevents native studies and black studies from a fuller account of the mechanics of this world. By the way, this is the only evidence that is about all the evidence in the debate, especially the alternative. That's Leroy 16. Rather than framing exclusion, the unfortunate fact that to be remedied by inclusion within the nation, indigenous white theory form frames settler colonialism and racial slavery. The recognition the possibility hinges the inclusion and exclusion, but misnames and violence and narrows any sense of problems and how can be rejected exclusive. Claims are incompatible. Each field reduces the other. Liberal multicultural in these theories and I cannot fully account for the immenseness of black and indigenous accounts with one another in the USA. What is scholars spend a sexually oriented to the impact this word is helpful for understanding the impact of slavery relegates a form of racialization, colonialism that do not self-subordinate slavery in their own anti-black multiculturalism is led king to claim that black states are articulating the face of settler colonialism. Black racialization occurred in tandem with the settler ideology, and not merely just to the field. Theorize the black racialization where that precludes a serious engagement in indigenous possession of blackness, exclusion from the category of the human assets and noble self. The loss of suffering can be framed as loss of subordinate normal, while as may be a generative theoretical claim that sexual coherence, assessments, and self-affirming slavery and anti-blackness is simply not historically accurate. And there's an animacy that's set to their analytical sovereignty because it asserts control. And this is proven in CEDA to the one in CEDA. It asserts control over place and control over land as the condition for humanity, whereas the affirmative already understood land itself as agential in its own right. The goal of the 1AC isn't sovereignty over land, but sovereignty from the void. That means we seek relational attachments that are created by the land, not sovereign control over it. Our argument is that settler fascism is void of relational attachment on Turtle Island. And they just replicate that by saying we have control over land. And Westphalian sovereignty, they attach purely Westphalian notions of sovereignty onto nativeness, which disarticulates relationship with land in favor of property, making this maintains an irreversible and predestined march towards progress, where land becomes the medium for progress, which presupposes land as empty and open to settlement. That's a reason to reject their scholarship, per our bird, and all 18 events from the 1AC. Yeah, Perm probably solves everything.
Okay, are you good?
Just give me a second.
Yeah.
Here's this. All right, yeah.
Okay, I want to start at the bottom. What is the warrant to the Westphalian sovereignty kind of argument?
Yeah. So our argument is that you disarticulate relations with land in favor of property making via your like CED's question, where we were like, what is sovereignty? And y'all were like, control over place.
Okay, so why does the alternative endorse those things?
I mean, the alternative is based on your analytic of sovereignty.
Okay, I guess the the Zeller's evidence, it seems to just be talking about like black people have this like relationship to land. I guess how is this responsive to things like the Garva evidence that's kind of talking about moves of decolonization that, you know, reintroduce kind of slavery? I cannot hear you.
I'm so sorry. We think that misreads our understanding of decolonization, not as control over land or sort of control of property or any of those things, but rather a relation with an agency. The agential capacity of land turns all of your link arguments.
So I guess what does the AF do to resolve those things?
Yeah, correlative relationality is a good mechanism for having contextual conversations as to how sovereignty emerges through land.
Okay, I guess I want to talk about your answers to the Johnson evidence then. If we were to have conversations about, I guess, land and that analysis, what are the mechanisms through which you can stop things like anti-Black violence within those discussions?
Yeah, so we think that those mechanisms are uniquely like hidden right now because relations have been severed. So our argument is a try or die argument. We think that settler fascism has severed spatial relations that allow for like the Black body to be seen as fungible and accumulative. Our argument is that only by resolving that form of settler fascism and only by resolving the settler fascist tendency to view the human as exceptional, can there be any mechanism of solvency whatsoever?
So
I
guess my question is like, if this is true, what does the AF do in order to like challenge like the overarching structure of things like U.S. alliance commitments?
Yeah, so we repair those relationships that I talked about being severed.
So it's like we should repair. Okay, for sure. I guess that makes sense. The next argument I want to talk about is the Robinson evidence. It seems to be in the context of like, wait, is it the Robinson evidence? Yeah, the Robinson evidence. I'm not sure that it does. It seems to be a very specific analysis of Wilderson. I guess how does this assume like the Sorrentino evidence that is kind of answering really what Robinson is saying here?
Sure. More so, it's using Wilderson as it's critiquing Wilderson and critiquing the same thing that you're doing, which is viewing native sovereignty as based on land, which is not true because native sovereignty has been voided by settler fascism and spatial relations. That's our argument.
All right, 10 minutes starting now. All right, 549. 549. The order is the K. There's no doc, by the way. All right, Devon's good, Kenny's good, UCO, are y'all good? All right. We must understand slavery as the lover for black time. The Middle Passage is the birth of blackness, and the New World intersected death and send the war and evidence slave ledgers, the whole of the ship bodies laying in a congruent relation to each other. The actualization of slavery created black beings through violence, labor, technology, finance, government, communication, science, religion. All were made possible by the transatlantic slave trade. Blacks don't exist in exchange. The modern world instead exists in exchange without standing in the world, without being in a relation, which cemented the instrumentality of the slave's ontological relationship to the metaphysics and the will. The human desire to rise up in the history secured the relationship between blacks and the new world, which say that blackness lacks the ontology produced by fantasies and misstaffed views of management and logic of self, while the other is different. The racial schema is realized as fetish phobia and exists as racial disfigurement. The human has constructed the racialized body out of fantasies, which is the same modernity project onto the slave. The racial schema of the skin becomes the medium for disfiguration. Other evidence is wrong. It means the notions of tendency exists outside non-black people. Blackness is always already marked for death. This seen through extra violence and is structured by the liberal economy, which require the theorization of social death cannot explain the death of Flando Castile, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Amendment 2, or Eleanor Bumper is not going to read. Their permanent social death is what results in the violence of things like cruel optimism and battle fatigue, because you force black people to engage in a coalition and forms of relationality, which only results in self-vulnerability of blackness. Roll the ballot as well for the team who has the best orientation towards blackness. I'll do the alternative here. We must contrast settler colonialism and racial slavery to challenge racial slavery remaining unthought within black studies. We must sit on slavery as an analytic for an uninheritable, as inescapable history and untranscendable horizon, structured through black uncertainty to think, not through relationality. The alternative does not say that we should not shift the terms of engagement, staying with the affirmative returns us to the body in relation to our land, labor, language, and lineage without thinking about capture and commodification. From the alternative says slavery is a study of capitalism, colonialism, and colonialism. Slavery is the struggle for abolition, the promise of communism, decolonization. Slavery radicalizes every radical action. The alternative is a perverse affirmation of a Jewish nation of politics without claim, without beyond sovereignty. Think of the black unsovereign, beyond restoration, beyond land, beyond property. The slave precedes the land. The alternative should be evaluated prior to the affirmative. The affirmative alternative addresses the structural antagonism of blackness by returning objective value to blackness through black uncertainty, which one questions the political capacity of the human and catalyzes the agency as black publishing activity. And second, removes the psychic burden of parasitic grammar of suffering. In this instance, by ending the libidinal domination of blackness is victimized capacity. The slave's cause then is no longer tethered to a finite politic that's allowed to be doused by apologist rhetoric. The affirmative is a barrier to black theory because it compromises, de-escalates antagonistic affect, and produces semiotic that reclaims the objective value of blackness by reasserting the ruse of analogy that structurally adjusts black desire and tethers it to a flesh for black indigenous freedom. Freedom is where it comments really is a symbol which conceals the perfection of slavery, which means the permutation can never solve, but there'll be more in the winner or the link debate. Garbo and Sorrentino. Sovereignty is preoccupied with the hatred for the black imago. The affirmative struggled to separate sovereignty and genocide from the machination of slavery, to say that they're constitutive, that they operate hand in hand. The ability to project cartography or space and time to demand that there be a restorative self-determination that de-escalates the antagonism of slavery and is an opportunity for anti-blackness to intensify itself in response to indigenous political demands. The fantasy of the indigenous refusal is still cloaked in the psychosexual dynamics of anti-black phobia, that is also extended itself as a means of personhood, not just because of political sovereignty through treaties, but there's a juxtaposition of the slave by place with land and rights, which assumes that there are blacks that embody a place and that natives have a sort of genocide, which makes it so that blacks are proto-settlers, and it seeks to racialize native people from their relationship towards racial blackness. This means that our theorizations about the libidinal economy are good because it's a question of the way that the human has been prefigured and the structural logics of civil society, which come first. The attempt to think of loss in the context of genocide for sections, one that does not speak to the absence, or one of loss of language, lineage, labor, or even the most important loss of all, the total loss of being, until it becomes a Wilderson in terms of ruse of analogy that sort of hides the fungible position of blackness or substance to colonial encounters. Sexton is saying that the narrative obscures the antagonism and nexus as a mode of redress and reclamation that sort of ties to act not neutral in relation to the gratuitous violence of racial slavery or tries itself. It also means that their demands regarding relationality don't result in anything, which means you can vote negative on presumption because the way their evidence says refusal in everyday encounters in forms of relationality and tending to the land and the mushrooms, which means that are just liberal notions of sovereignty and right, which is double turn with the affirmative, for the alternative. This answers their Zeller evidence because slavery precedes any form of relationality that we can have in guarded relationality, and that assumption that land grounds black being ties their being towards an analytic of labor and capital depends on an economy of fungible labor that ignores the capacity to be arranged and rearranged or manipulated by a metaphysical Holocaust. The 2AC doesn't explain how blacks have a relation to slavery and southern colonialism, only how indigenous people have a relation to the sovereignty of the void, which isn't sufficient enough for the criticism because the criticism about the way that black people relate to the affirmative and slavery. The Robinson link term doesn't solve the critique because they say we don't have forms of relationality. The Robinson card from the 2AC is another link. Their argument is sovereignty is different for the native because the forms of cultural differences extend the wilderness performativity card. Their affirmative papers over the ontological structure by situating us on temporal maps reinforced by categories of positive value. They assume the slave is a social subject that can overdetermine its abjectness. Wooderson says that blacks are denied personhood at the level of the political, social, symbolic, and ontological, which means sociality, i.e. the process of determination, i.e. the micro-political regime of the 1AC concludes itself. It only becomes a cyclical process of fungibility for the slave because all the section evidence about the economy, the desire about how it gets refrigerated on the flesh, we differ winning a marginal link to how we tend to regard or talk about performance, assuming it can be solved as a social procedure of education. That means the absence of process of self-adjustment. They say Westphalian sovereignty decept. There is no clear link. It doesn't matter how we define sovereignty because our argument is that blackness is always unsovereign and starts from position of dispossession. But your idea that we can have a sovereignty or be unsovereignty in relation to the void is our argument that blackness is always within the void or devoid of relationality. On the animacy dissent, it's another link to the K when we say that we have to, when they say we have to have sovereignty from the void, our argument is that blackness can't have that sovereignty from the void to begin with because blackness is always already that void, which cannot overcome that sovereignty, which is why we have to focus on an analytic of slavery. On to the next government, Tarantino card, the Winnesey's notion of sovereignty ultimately is just a slave narrative. Their discussion of black life being interconnected to land is the humanizing function, the songs, the dances together. It's like when your evidence says space and place give black lives meaning in a world that has deemed black populations or contingent geographies as ungeographic. Wooderson says that it's how the slave becomes a reasonable subject in order to demonstrate humanity. The affirmatives situate itself indigeneity as a means to overcome the transcend the black status or its value as a commodity. Wooderson says that through slavery, the death of the African happens materially and symbolically so that the construction of language is impossible. The 1EC's discussion of communities that have grounded relationality still hold on to their values and traditions to move beyond the half forms of agency becomes another narrative that ignores that slave is brought to its awareness of its own subjectivity of its emancipation by writing itself into the consciousness of spirituality. And so the slave becomes a subject through the language of Western modernity, i.e. the slave becomes spiritual. The subject can only recognize itself as a conscious sort of being in the world, never actually being in the world. There is terror that mitigates or enwraps the subject in terms of its own social relations. So the subject is not marked by freedom, but instead the slave exists in relation to the trauma of slavery, which inscribes indigeneity as subjugation to the codes of law, which is a slave writing and materiality only marked by the residual experience of nothing. Since the slave only exists in that relation, we cannot focus on forms of grounded relationality because those modes of relationality always paper over the way that slavery is the starting analytic. The affirmatives by rotation of communities who ignore metaphysics is already structured by loss of those communities exist as a displaced composition, and the attempt to exceed a moment in black time ignores two distinct symbolic economies: the desire to exist outside modernity and the ability to identify yourself in relation to the world, or both ordered by the economy of slavery. For the slave, in order to gain subjectivity, it must kill the African body. The slave cannot change the structural position because the black is nothing lacks the ontological ground of being, which proves affirmative is a process of naming that mystifies how captivity and dismemberment remove flesh from space, time, and history, which means that exists outside of their narrative. The black subject is always the will of a violent formation, which is to say that narrativation cannot grant access to the body because language, groups, bloodlines, aims, and properties are all arranged by the legal and judicial protocol of slavery itself. And so the act is so structured by a dominant symbolic order that maintains the taxonomy on race is indicative of their evidence is Refuting because their folding of slavery into the settler triad is making the fungibility as it ignores the violence that's created by chattel slavery as a distinct form of violence. I'll extend Warren here. They didn't really answer it. Slavery is an event horizon that alters stories that could explain your heritage of your past, your lineage, or kinship. So that's when see Warren. For the slave, those cultural codes don't come into being because one is not in control of their dreams. A mind is not in our possession. For the slave, dreams are one of captivity, a form of absence, a loss that cannot be registered. Blacks don't own their bodies. The relationality that they talk about becomes another dream. Their evidence is indicative of presuming a form of captivity when it takes that quote, Anarcho-indigenism is relational, which is why accepting the evidence is impacting because their theorization tells black people to look to gain sovereignty and re-indigenization through cultural practices, which is why Sexton indicates that this is what ignores the violence of slavery. The cultural practices are like the evidence here in the 2AC about black people tending to the land. These black indigenous will always be regarded as black as slavery is what codes metaphysics onto blackness, that changes from subject to object. Their approach to what Sexton calls a deracialization, where they attempt to use their emancipatory discourse to move past the violence of slavery. That's not that can't happen under the 1AC. This dispossession of slavery that changes the absence that exists between the record, the archive, and the conditions that make slavery possible. The legal codes of slavery provide the moment in which we seek to develop self-consciousness, which is ultimately an illusion in objective time, which turns the affirmative, because through the analytic of slavery, we can start to see the way that ancestors and lost languages always fill the symbolic order with the fixed notion of humanity and recognition of the slave doesn't have, because for the slave is always barred from humanity, barred from language, barred from cultural traditions, because the way that Blackness was misimmigrated from the Middle Passage. So we should use the Middle Passage as an event horizon and a starting analytic instead of starting from the notion of grounded relationality. And open for cross-ex.
All right, sweet. You explained how the native is situated in the world. You explained how Black people are situated in the world. How is land situated in the world?
Black people are situated as landless. Native people are situated as people that have had their land taken from them, but that can be restored.
Okay, what about the land itself? You explained Black people's relation and Native people's relation to land.
Well, that's our
how
argument.
is land situated under your framework?
Well, that's our argument. We can't look at land in a vacuum, because Black life is the tethering of all of these things together.
How does an anti-Black structural framework for violence view land itself? Not view relation to land, but view land, the ground.
Our argument is that it views land, the ground, as something that the Black body does not have access to. That's something that Black
how does it come to that determination?
Because of the way that the Middle Passage barred Africans from their kinship and subjectivity on their land and took them to another land where they were not regarded as people.
So it started with the loss of land.
Well, it started with the loss of subjectivity.
Sure. So you made arguments about there's metaphysical reasons that Black people will always be seen as Black. How does that relate to Black and Native people?
It relates to Black and Native people because Black Native people will always be seen as Black first. Why? Because slavery is what overcodes the notions of the Black imago, i.e., when you see someone that has both or is like Afro-Mexican or Afro-Native, you see them as Black first because the ways that Blackness is always an overcoding, because the ways that slavery always forefronts Blackness, because everything exists in opposition to Blackness, which is why Blackness has to be the starting analytic if we want to talk about different forms of violence, because slavery catalyzes and mobilizes all those forms of violence. It's the backdrop for the play, all those forms of violence that happen.
Sure. And I guess, is all of that just actually, never mind. You said that slavery precedes relationality, and that's why the Zeller's evidence about mushrooms doesn't matter. I guess, why does slavery prevent watching mushrooms grow?
Because slavery predetermines one capacity to be a human.
What does that have to do with watching mushrooms grow, and why does that prevent Black people from watching mushrooms grow?
Well, I mean, obviously Black people can watch mushrooms grow, but that doesn't do anything for the structures of slavery.
Sure.
I can look at some mushrooms, sure.
Sure, cool. Grant, you got anything? Yeah, we're good.
Were the cards sent? No. Now they should have been sent. Okay. It's the alternative, the permutation on the critique, and then the case page.
I'm sorry, do you mind saying that one more time?
The alternative, it's the K page, the alt, perm, then the case. Oh, what is happening? Oh, okay. Okay. Looks like Devon's good. Or, sorry, Kenny's good, Will's good, UCO's good, Devon's good. Cool. We must contrast settler colonialism with racial slavery to challenge racial slavery remaining unthought within Black studies. We must sit on slavery as an analytic for the uninheritable and escapable history and untransable horizon structured through Black insurgency. To think the alternative does not say that we should shift the terms of engagement, but saying that the affirmative returns us to the body of relation to land and labor, language, and lineage without thinking about the capture and commodification. The alternative said that slavery is the study of capitalism, colonialism, and settler colonialism. Slavery is the struggle for abolition, the promise of communism, decolonization. Slavery radicalizes every radical action. The alternative is a pervasive affirmation of de-racialization in politics without claim, without demand. We must move beyond sovereignty to think of Black unsovereign, beyond restoration, beyond land, beyond property. The slave precedes the land, and the alternative should be evaluated prior to the affirmative. The alternative addresses the structural antagonism of anti-Blackness by returning the objective of value to Blackness through things like back insurgency, which one crushes the political capacity of the human and catalyzes the agency of the Black and phobogenic negativity. Second, it removes the psychic burden of parasitic grammar suffering of the incest by upending the libido domination of Blackness as victimizing capacity. The slave's cause is then no longer tethered to the finite politic that allows itself to be dosed by apologist rhetoric. The affirmative is a barrier of black terror because it compromises, de-escalates antagonistic affect, and produces a semiotic that reclaims the objective value of Blackness by reasserting a rules of analogy that structurally adjust Black desire and tethers. It is a fetish of Black and Indigenous freedoms. It dreams where incommensurability is the symbol which conceals the perfection of slavery, which means that the permutation also cannot solve. I'm going to do the permutation here. Treat the 1AC and the entirety of the 1AC as a plain text. Non-topical affirmative must be evaluated responsibility for defending every part of the 1AC. Otherwise, you get to pick and choose which parts of the advocacy matter and is unpredictable. This means that this debate should come down to competing methods. The negative has we have picked out the performance of the 1AC, and we have picked out the methods of the 1AC responding to settler fascism. Any permutation would deviate from that. It would pick out the two theorizations of settlerism, which is severance. It demonstrates what non-topical affirmatives must have a stable advocacy. The 1AR has to explain what parts of negative counter method they advocate in relationship to the on how it resolved the dissent without serving part of the affirmative. No net benefit of the permutation turns case arguments prove only risk that they cause harm. You don't get a permutation. You had infinite pref and made a choice about the 1AC, which means that any permutation is severance and it is impossible to be negative because we don't get the links to the 1AC. All dissents are permutations. All links are dissents to the permutations because they link to the 1AC. Reject the argument. Their model incentivizes bad debate because people are held accountable for things they say are justified. Their model encourages things like sexism and racism debate. Our model creates nuance, clash, and debate, fosters good accountability methods. It still links or is severance. All of the specific link arguments are dissents to the permutation. Proves that they can't jettison away their methodology. They don't get a permutation without a stable advocacy. Methodology permutations are also a reason to reject a team. The 1AC positions itself as an inflexible solution to the colonialism. The permutation deviates from that analysis. We're competing methodology related to the structures of anti-Blackness. Their externalization fundamentally inconsistent with our analytic. The second is good for education. Comparing methods is the only way to have productive discussion about strategic resistance. Their model destroys debate's transformative potential. There is also no permutation because we're picking out the as politics, Fullerton in 16. I would love someone to show me how do we be Afro-pessimism strong. Black Lives Matter has the potential to do all of this, but in order for that to happen, the movement has to have two trains running. This was an important teaching moment for the simulation exercise. I tell the exercise strategy and tactics. I call it two trains running. It is the important way, important for us to transform our political rhetoric in the horizon of our revolutionary goals to higher than transforming police behavior. I'm not saying Black Lives Matter is a tactic that move toward reform of police behavior be abandoned because we need relief down. We need two trains running. We have to have that tactical and immediate response to police violence. The Tucky evidence is mostly answered by the Garvin Sorrentino evidence and the two link extension, the 2 and C, but also the Wilderson performativity link that was also cross-applied from the case page. Now, our argument is that due to the ontological structure of Blackness, it obviously is the way that Blackness is able to communicate and have relationality. This is Brady and 12 violence that produces the subject of vocality as much literally as ontologically. Insofar as the object cannot speak, it cannot be said in the communicate. Communicate is the logic of the commons or commonality, informing to participate in the world, sharing one structured utterance, a joint community. Communication is not even to simply anything. A series of ethics of dialogue requires an ethical ontological status amongst communications. The Leroy evidence, they've miscut it. Here's their cutting that proves the links are opposite and what they're evident and proves the links and shows that their understanding of all violence through the lens of settler colonialism curves the way that anti-Blackness within settler society. We indicted Leroy in 16. Indigenous studies suffers from the similar oversights. Bird is one of the number of Indigenous scholars who exceptionalizes Indigenous and non-Indigenous divided. What do they account for non-Indigenous except as settlers? There has not been sufficient theorization on how to interrogate the slave into a theory of colonialism. Wolf represents the uncomprehensive version. Wolf writes that enslaved people immigrated with their will was part of a native dispossession. Bird proposes the notion of a variance mark at a variance. Go to the case page, the King evidence. The no direct answer. The 1EC's investment in a form of multicultural resistance fosters white supremacy of the left because it non-acknowledges the one's presence in the way that Black bodies talk within those are puppet for white liberalism. The presence of Blackness in the movement necessitates obfuscation, marginalization, exploitation. This assumes that the abs gestures are protesting and assumes that the illusion of collectivity meant to dismantle white supremacist notion of domination. Instead, what King says is that results in more white supremacy. Now, to assert their own agenda, the affirmative will always refuse to ignore the way the moment to ask themselves self-critical of action, even if the affirmative creates a movement and gestures for reclaiming the political as an act of protest or meaningful tool for resisting imperialism. There is still an unequal distribution of power that privileges among whites in the movement, or privileges non-black people in the movement, which guarantees the inability to organize on certain issues that affect black people. Their arguments are stated as it's been in context of anti-war. Yes, but you don't have a mechanism to resolve things like intercommunal violence. And then the fascism isn't the root cause, which was explained above, because it's a thing of ontological structuring of the way that blackness is created. I'm going to do the Johnson evidence here. Extend the black femphobia to said white. It's an example of the example of it is that white within the Communist Party there was violence that happened, i.e., the super exploitation that happens to black women. They don't have a kind of a form of metric. The analysis that we don't know those relationships is pretty violent, and you shouldn't take the risk on those, even if the NPR evidence that I'm not going to read says that the Cherokee Nation created racial markers of things like blood quantum in order to expel black people from their place, which means that you should be skeptical of all of their relationality arguments.
8:30.
Okay, stop at 5:30. Grant, I think, got kicked from the call, so we gotta get.
Tell them there's no cards, and yeah.
There's no cards.
When I get back in the call, I'll give the order.
There's no cards. When Grant gets back in the call, he'll give the order. Okay. Yeah, Grant had this problem this morning. It's just gonna take like a second for his computer to like unfreeze, and then I don't know, Zoom fucks with this shit. I don't know. Okay, until Grant's computer fixes itself, he's just gonna do it off mod headset and everything. So yeah. So like right there.
Great. I am very sorry about that, you all. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Again, my apologies. It'll be the case on top then the K, starting at the 1 in R, and then the 2 in C, and I'll signpost like from there. Yeah, I gotcha. I'll be careful. Okay, is everyone good? Okay. Fascism impact is conceded. Our 1AC Robbins evidence assumes all of their ontology arguments, but says that it could still get worse and make the world a worse place for Black and Indigenous people because the operations of fascism even more quickly generate the violence of anti-Blackness, which means that intensification matters and something that only the AF has a mechanism of solving, which turns any risk of their offense. You should vote affirmative to affirm Black and Indigenous alliances through grounded relationality that shifts the modes, shifts the terms of relationality and produces new kinship structures. The King evidence on the case that's not about the app, it's just about protest in the abstract, which isn't what the affirmative does. It generates a form of relationality that shifts those relations, which also solves the Black femphobia dissent. Their only contextualization of this is about the party relations of commies, which is not the affirmative. The next argument they make about blood quantums perfectly encapsulates our argument. Blood quantum was not a strategy employed by Native people to kick Black folks out of the tribe, but rather employed by white people to take Native land and garner a Native identity for themselves as a cultural conception, which proves the ways in which settlement negatively impacts Black people in material ways that have textures of violence that only the affirmative attunes itself to. Go to the criticism. Permutation do both, solves 100% of their offense and has numerous net benefits. The first is that we solve their structural analytic, even if they win that parts of their alternative mechanism are incompatible with the affirmative. We can solve their structural analytic, which is where they garner all of their offense, which solves all of their offense, because racial slavery is insufficient to understand the violence of the world without the affirmative. It's not severance, because the F was always about structural anti-Blackness, the way in which it operates. Don't reject the team, because it's a question of the ways in which we relate to those forms of violence, which the permutation solves better. The Wilderson and Brady evidence are insufficient to overcome the affirmative, because we take into account all of their criticisms of ontology and shift away from a totalizing account of it. Their reading of the Leroy evidence. I'll do that whole debate now. You should refuse exceptionalism in both Black and Native studies as a side constraint, because anything else risks overcoding the other as liberal multiculturalism. Their evidence just says that Native people can do it too, which was always our point, which is why the affirmative is written in such a way as to avoid that sort of overcoding of nativeness as radically exceptional or different. The part they read is about Bird, but it's about Bird in 2011, not 2018 Bird, describing forms of relationality with Black people as not settlers, which solves and is a corrective to all of their offense, which is what the affirmative is. It's a form of grounded relationality that produces those forms of kinship structures. Relationality is possible and valuable and worth striving for, which solves cruel optimism, because it doesn't cruelly optimistically hold toward a totalizing world, but rather finds ways to engage in particular moments of struggle that can be good. The battle fatigue argument is solved through a form of Black spirituality with land. The Tuckall et al. Evidence from the 1AC, 2AC, and the Zeller's evidence describe numerous examples, such as walking the land, having conversations about the ways in which the land differentially implicates different bodies, and understanding the agency of things like the mushrooms on the land, that are all ways in which their interpretation of violence overcodes settlement as a mechanism of violence and disavows the agency and materiality of land. Land is not only something that is not a property that exists with one that can one own, which solves all of the sovereignty link arguments and proves that their theory of power would necessarily reify a form of human exceptionalism that they have not answered. The link debate. Group it. Robinson turns every link argument they've made. 2AC Robinson says that native sovereignty is a void. It was always a fiction to be undermined or didn't exist at all, because in order to uphold that notion, one would have to embark in a form of settler meaning making, which turns all of their time arguments from the Warren evidence, because native sovereignty exists outside of settler temporality, which means they have misnamed the violence of civil society for settler temporal logics of violence. The settler and the master are the co-constitutive structures of of civil society, which means that it's necessary to take into account the ways in which all of those forms of violence can be articulated. This is not liberal multiculturalism, but rather the understanding that there are two antagonisms of civil society that solve all that resolve the sort of impact to all of their offense, because it's just a question of the ways in which we can analyze Black suffering, which is something the AF does. Thus, the role of the ballot arguments, I think, are mishandled from the 2AC. It describes the ways in which we need material praxis as well as a structural analysis, which means that they have no mechanism of ever doing anything about their structural analysis, which means that you should affirm the AF's practice of grounded relationality that produces good mechanisms of being and relating ethically to one another, which is the only impact if they win that all of these structures are inevitable as per the libidinal economy, which means it's just a question of relationality. Relationality becomes the only question if they win that we are utterly fucked, because it's just a question of it's just a question of what we do while we are terminally unable to sort of overcome those notions, which means that the libidinal economy arguments go F. All of their ontological ordering arguments necessarily mean they have to link to the Leroy evidence, which should be an unwritable ballot because it requires you to subordinate native violence in order to sort of exceptionalize all Black suffering as a mechanism of which is itself a mechanism of colonial erasure, which means that you should not ally anti-native violence in order to sort of resolve or navigate anti-Blackness, because to do so necessarily coheres the mechanics that structure this world and will always reify anti-Blackness. It also is bad for Black Indians, which is sort of like the cross-ex moment that I don't think they answer.
All right, 549. 549. Sorry now.
Oh yeah, there you are. That was good.
All right, that's time. The order is going to be the case and then the critique.
I'm here and I'm good. I'm gonna keep my camera off if it's cool with everyone, because I don't want that to happen again.
All right, and is Kenny good? All right. You can group King and Johnson together. Ontology overdetermines forms of relationality. Both cards each have different movements that pushed out black people and threatened them or used them. One for communism and the other for the anti-war movement, which are things not mutually exclusive to the AF's relationality, because they would defend black people relate to others. These movements. So 1AR literally says the AF creates relationality, that relationality to be relating with one another. What does that mean? If ontology is overdetermined the way black people are positioned within society, then it means they can't resolve the King evidence or the Johnson evidence. 1AR doesn't explain what exactly kinds of relationality they defend. Aside from relationality is possible with black people, argument is that relationality will always magnetize bullets, laughs, and scorn and attempts to pulverize black flesh. It's sufficient enough to vote on presumption. They don't tell you anything about these forms of relationality aside from black people being wed with mushrooms and the land. What does that mean, and how does that resolve the incoming war that they're talking about? The incoming fascist knows to us from the 1AR doesn't explain any of that. You should hold them to that. They give you vague notions of relating to one another to resolve issues, but the work is not done to explain how. The Brady evidence that this has a permutation in the AF. We win the ontological position of the blackness, and there is no possibility of the common for black people. Their method of creating a form of relationality is problematic because it gives coherence to society by leaving blackness with no means to communicate within the common, because you miss using this question of ontological position of blackness. This would implicate the good of their relationality. If humanism is repaired out post after, then you should question yourself, what is the role of black people within that relationality? Then this is relied upon a subject position within society. The Brady evidence, which is not answered by the 1AR, is fantastic on the question that in order to be within a common, one has to communicate. For blackness, the ability to communicate has always already been denied. The method of relationality just becomes another move versus the foundational politics anti-blackness. Cross-apply that onto the permutation decay. Hold the 2AR to the 1AR, draw a line. No new 2AR arguments, because they didn't answer a lot of our nuance coming out of the block. Slavery is the extremity of anti-blackness. That's the warrant evidence. And our argument is that the middle passage opposes black time on the African body. Send the 1 and C Fullerton evidence that says regardless of the African community and its performance, it cannot change the structural conditions that make blackness a void of relationality among all African bodies. Just reading this question that takes out all their grounded relationality stuff, because there is no form of relationality. They are not ahead on the ontology debate, and conceding some of the liberal economy debate puts them worse. They consider all of the examples of extra legal violence that tear apart, i.e. a past or a present or a future for the slave. The examples of Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Gordon Gaines, Ahmaud Arbery, Philando Castile, different black people killed extrajudicially by the state, proves that exceeds the level of rationality. There's a gut check here. They don't answer any of our arguments about how black time doesn't move for black bodies. It accumulates. We're not critiquing native time, which means that your answers are non-responsive to the black time decide coming out of the 2 and C, which means your notion of rationality are merely cruel optimism, especially when the example is black people are looking for mushrooms. Yes, I definitely can watch mushrooms, but that doesn't tend to how my body is situated to magnetize bullets at any time. If I am on the land looking at mushrooms, I can still get shot by a fucking cop, and that's not going to save me. The impact of the black time decide is theoretical aphasia, the inability to contend with the black time diminishes the ontological and existential violence of slavery, which reduces the event horizon of slavery into an object to conquer and get over. Warren says that the desire to gain distance from blackness animates the affirmative's refusal, which answers their argument that the native sovereignty exists outside of liberal time. Our argument isn't that natives don't have a separate time, but that a more nuanced claim about how black time for black time violence accumulates and time accumulates on the perm. The perm isn't very well explained. They just say the analytic of slavery is sufficient. That's not sufficient. That's not enough, because we do want to work on why slavery is the key analytic, the event horizon that set the African subjectivity, i.e. Africans lost their kinship and subjectivity when they went into the middle passage as African and came out as black. Yes, it's a very broad explanation, but it's a lot more than what they're doing in the 1AR. They said libidinal economy is colonial erasure. The Leroy evidence, it's not because the libidinal economy assumes blackness in position within society. Well, their argument is that there are alternative modes for which violence exists. They conceded permutations are bad, so you can really take a cheap shot and reject the team on this, because we gave 2 reasons. First, education comparing methods is the only way to have productive discussions about resistance strategies, and they can see if that it's inflexible because the permutation deviates from the analysis of slavery, which is a form of anti-blackness, and the debate, which is, if you want to, you can just vote neg on this theory argument that goes cold conceded coming out of the 1AR. If you don't, we're just going to crossify the Brady evidence here, because it still was conceded and turns to perm, because our argument that the black body is barred from forms of communication, which means it's barred from forms of relationality with one another, which is going to turn the entirety of the affirmative, literally breaking the entirety of the affirmative, because black bodies are barred from the communication that has forms of relationality, which means that yes, there are black people looking at mushrooms and being on with the land, but one, what does that have to do with relationality in terms of solving further impacts? And two, our argument is that that is not enough. On the alternative, they don't answer any of it. The role of the ballot arguments aren't about materiality, doesn't matter, because we are a pick out of the 1AC's focus on relationality, extend sex and communities of color desire for recognition within their own label rights is driven by a fundamental anxiety and fear of flesh phobia and philia and phobogenesis is why decolonization becomes another tool for de-radicalization. Remember, this is a pick. We can still defend the forms of like resisting against forms of violence are good, but where we draw the offense is forms of relationality are bad. But our argument is that we have to theorize blackness as unsovereign, that which does not have forms of relationality with one another, which solves the entirety of the case because it detaches itself away from the notions that the 1AC talks about. Now I'm going to the link debate here. You can't just go on the link debate and say group it. We have turned the affirmative, so you cannot vote affirmative because the 1AR does not give a single reason why forms of grounded relationality are good and possible. Our link is to the way they posit grounded relationality as a good idea for black people. The fantasy of political community is imaginable through a positive symbolic mediation. The athletes to become familiarized with presume ontological and ethical relational status. They conceded the rereading of their evidence, i.e. when they highlighting when I said that their Tuck et al. 14 evidence says, quote, space and place give black lives meaning in a world that has deemed black population and their attendant geographies as geographies where we take the issue because we're not dealing with the impact level, we'll be damning with them because it means the risk of a link means you vote negative. Arguments that forms of relationality, i.e. the Brady stuff I did above, is all reasons why we can't have forms of relationality, which turns the entirety of the affirmative because it means that we cannot relate to one another. It also means there's no permutation. If you don't buy permutations or bad theory, there's not a single reason to vote F in this debate because you should be skeptical of their shift. The example of the Cherokee I said it was not about white people. It was about Native people barring black people. That's our argument. They have no ways for black people to relate to white people or Native people given the Brady evidence.
Okay. Yeah, can everyone hear me? Okay.
You're a little soft.
How's that? Okay. All right. Just confirmation when everyone gets here. Okay. Kenny, are you here? All right, cool.
Yeah, I'm good. Sorry.
Oh, sweet. All right, I'll be the AF and then the critique. Yeah, and Devon, you said you were good. I think I saw a check or something. All right, sweet. All right, then I will start in a few seconds.
This debate comes down to whether or not Black people can reclaim geographic dimensions and struggles over the meaning to place that geographic dimensions to practices of Black reclamation, because our examples from the 2AC and 1A are about like walking the land and having conversations about particular attachments to the places we cross, understanding Black spatial relations and how they are used to sever relation to that land, how that land was used to anti-Black violence, understanding how Indigenous clearing paved the way for that violence to occur on this land. Our evidence points to things like collaborating on the destruction of property ownership relations to begin working with and through land instead of collaborating on land, and all of this is conceded. If Blackness is ungeographic like the negatives say it is, then that geography can be taken back from the settler master. Plus, they conceded fascism makes all their impacts inevitable, which means it's try or die for relations outside of anti-Black settler hierarchies. They conceded the entirety of the top of the 1AR on case that said it's try or die now because fascism is intensifying, which means we have to prioritize material strategies of resistance that seek to undermine settler fascism, severing of relationality that constitutes anti-Black violence and settler colonial violence on this land. Now, they made arguments on the case that the decolonial movements of the 1AC are bad, but neither of those are about decolonial movements of the 1AC. They're about like leftist organization that has nothing to do with indigeneity, has nothing to do with relationality, the relationality that we're talking about, because none of that evidence is about grounded relationality. It's all just about relationality amongst each other. We have made specific arguments about how coming or building relationality through the land generates specific moments of impasse that prevent those movements from being bad, like they said they were, which is a good enough justification for the permutation in this debate. But they also don't really answer the arguments at the blood quantum, which prove our arguments, because the blood quantum example is proof that the co-constitutive nature of violence and the way that harm against Native nations and sovereignties produce harm for Black people. You cannot separate them, which proves our Leroy argument, which is why structural analytic comes first, because it's ethically prior and necessary to generate an explanation and encounter the whole phenomenon. This is when you can go to the critique. Exceptionalism creates a reason to prefer a triadic understanding of settler colonialism and anti-Blackness because it avoids collapsing one into the other. Our argument is that they are twin antagonisms that co-constitute one another. The two are not separate processes that stop when they collide, but rather are reproduced together, which means that only given an account of both can resolve either, which means their analytic understanding is a bad one because at the level of research, because it cannot comprehend relationality, grounded relationality, and has to suspend the exceptionalism in both Black and Indigenous studies as a side constraint, because the affirmative participates in this exceptionalizing frame and collapses the struggle of Indigenous into liberal multicultural calls for inclusion and participation, which is uniquely bad. Now, politics that claim to be antagonistic to the world structurally cannot be anti-Indigenous. You shouldn't sanction anti-Indigenous violence in the name of anti-Blackness because that project ceases to be antagonistic to this world. This turns their theory of power and reason about negative, because to do so would be to invest in Blackness as a radical form of non-being, which subordinates all Native demands of liberal multiculturalism, which turns the critique and also means that the permutation is the only way out. Let's go to the framework debate on the critique. One, material violence. They didn't really extend their role of the ballot in this debate, which means you default to the material practice to resolve structural violence, with the alternative cannot do. And grounded relationality solves it and is a necessary way to build relationality through the land in order to foster connections against the settler master hierarchies that situate relationality as something to be severed from Black and Indigenous people. Now, their blood quantum example from the 1 and R that they probably didn't want to extend in the 2 and R for a good reason proves that anti-Blackness and settler colonialism are twin antagonisms in civil society, which means this is a 1A argument that it makes it try or die for the permutation because the alternative doesn't do anything. And relationality is good if what they're saying is true and we are terminally fucked, then relationality is good because it allows us to generate strategies outside of frameworks that prioritize the human as exceptional and sever those relations. The Warren debate, they do not do a good enough job answering the Robinson 20 evidence. I'm pretty sure the 2 and R concedes that nativity is seen as a void in the status quo by the settler master, which fuels our framework arguments and our sovereignty arguments because it disproves the theorization that natives can reclaim Western sovereignty because they are always seen as the void, which also means that we turn their singular, that also means that we have a link turn to the Warren evidence because relationality uniquely resolves that. We also would critique Warren's use of a vision of a singular vision of Blackness that can, the singular vision of Blackness is uniquely bad because it erases specific experiences that are necessary for contextually rooted strategies to emerge. I'm going to go on to the contingent collaboration parts of the permutation because by suspending exceptionalism and having a form of grounded relationality, it creates the channels of communication that resolve any disadvantage to the permutation because all of the disads are just theoretical reasons why we might have issues with one another, but we can talk about all of that shit, which solves all the Brady offense because by generating the conversations necessary, then that uniquely resolves all of their offense on that. But also they have conceded that the human being prioritizes exceptional is uniquely bad. The only reason that they don't fuck with our grounded relationality is because they are stuck in the mindset of the settler master hierarchies of sovereignty, which are any disadds to grounded relationality, like getting shot while watching mushrooms is solved by the permutation. You can go there now. Oh, actually, real quick. The pick argument in the 2 and R means they think that resisting violence is good, which is something only the grounded relationality portion of the affirmative does, which means it doesn't solve anything. Now, on the permutation, there, one is no impact to perms being bad in the 2 and R, but also it's not a severance. Just we've been about this since the 1AC, and there's no reason to reject the team for that same reason. But also, you can extend the permutation, the Leroy evidence. I have already done that work at the top. I've already done that work on the case and at the top of the receipt that proves that we can suspend exceptionalism and still have good conversations that resolve any of the disadvantages of the permutation that are all just theoretical, not material reasons why we cannot work together. Now, they made this like the only other argument they have is that relationality itself is bad. Conceding that fascism is intensifying now means that doesn't matter because if we don't do anything, then we're all terminally fucked anyways. It makes it try or die for the permutation because relationality is good. Grounded relationality produces the strategies necessary for Indigenous and Black people to contest settler fascism. Fascism not being in the 2 and R is the reason they lose the debate.
Good debate.
Great debate, y'all.
Good debate, y'all.
Good debate, y'all.
Fullerton, if you are in the room, is Fullerton here? Hello? Vaughn?
Yeah, we're
Hey,
here.
is it possible that you can put the re-highlighting of the tuck evidence that's in the 2NR in the chat or in the chain?
Oh yeah, I'll grab it.
Grazie.
Hi, everyone. We have a decision whenever we have all our participants. All right, y'all. Hey, congratulations on reaching the semifinals of the 2021 CEDA National Championship. And thank all four of you for a wonderful debate. This was a very close debate. The winner on a 2-1 decision is the University of Central Oklahoma. Congratulations, y'all. And a really big congratulations to Cal State Fullerton. Y'all are amazing. I'm going to turn it over to the panel in just a sec, but congratulations, y'all.
Yeah, so I sat. I'm actually not surprised that this was the decision that happened. I had a good feeling that I would sit no matter what the outcome of this debate was, funny enough. But yeah, this was a very good and very close debate to me. I'm not surprised it was a split decision in the end. Can everyone hear me? Right? Okay, just make sure, right? I ended up voting neg on the pick. I think that the neg is winning the impact turn for most of the 2 hours, or with the most of the 2 hour offense isn't able to really reconcile for me by the framing questions you end up going for with relationality and try or die toward fascism. I thought this needed to be fleshed out a bit more in the 2 hour for me, especially around the affirmative advocacy, because I think that the neg is kind of winning these claims that you aren't really doing a good job of winning why, like, that means like the AF solves. I think that you're winning like there's a risk of a permutation because of your theorizations, but I don't think you're winning like that means the AF solves. And that's where I end up kind of delineating between impact framing for a lot of this debate. And so I spent a lot of time weaving through the kind of framing for this debate because I thought both teams were winning their idea of what debate should be about. But I think that the negative ends up winning a lot bigger claims about the impact level of Blackness and the positionality of Blackness that the affirmative really isn't grappling with by the 2AR with relationality for me to give you a lot of the offense you end up going for. And I have a hard time doing this because I do think that the negative is conceding like these like reasons why, you know, the perm is good in terms of education, but I think that they're winning an impact turn to that education through your like your logic of ethics. Like I think that the negative is winning your ethics kind of are still bad because of the ways in which they approach Blackness. Yeah, so I think, and for that reason, I think that the negative is able to frame a lot of your understanding of that is the reason why I shouldn't trust, you know, your ethics or solidarity or affirmation kind of project. And so I do read back through the Sexton and the Tuck and Yang kind of, and I do kind of end up being suspicious of exactly what the apps project is by the end of the debate. And I think that the 2 and R's recharacterization, the entirety of the negative kind of recharacterization of like staring at mushrooms or walking the land, or even kind of frame it through the Jones argument with the like case stuff that I don't really think is being answered so much, means that most of the perm offense is subsumed by the broader ethical claim that the AF can never solve. So it leads back to these kind of cruel optimisms or makes the violence of fascism inevitable anyway. I think that these are like disads these are like implicit impacts to links and disads that are going for on the top of like the framing of the debate that I'm not really to grapple with in the terms of relationality, right? And I think that you know, the 2 and R is doing an amazing job at framing like the positionality of Blackness, where it's like, you know, even if I'm looking at the land, if I get shot, then like that's something that the AF cannot grapple with through its relationality of land and geographies, because I think that they're not criticizing that you start from land, but more so the next step, which is like, because you think relation is possible because of the land or how the land operates, that you aren't really getting to get the offense off of like the perm could probably solve. Because I don't think that the AF is winning that claim yet. Yeah, and so I don't think that the negative ends up, or I don't think that the AF ends up dealing with a lot of the nuance on the ontology debate, which means that even I think the AF is good in some ethical project, I think the negative is winning that Blackness and its tension with being kind of the whole Warren extension. I don't think that the negative affirmative is really dealing with. It means that like, yeah, nothing is ethical in regards to theorizing violence and Blackness. And I just think that the neg ends up winning a huge impact turn to relationality that the perm can't really overcome. And I think that that's where the AF rests too much of its offense there, and instead needed more reasons. The alternative theory is bad for material violence in the way like the negative cannot theorize. And that's pretty much the TLDR. I'll stop ranting now, but yeah, thought this was a very good debate. And congratulations, Fullerton, and congrats, UCO.
I can go next. I will read because I wrote everything out already. First, this was an amazing debate. Definitely top 3 that I've seen this year. Definitely not 3 or 2. Low-key, maybe probably the best debate I've seen all year. And definitely some of the best research that I've seen all year. Like, I'm not out of the park with just the research, the interjection of the research, the way we're thinking about arguments. Super, super dope. Thanks for having me in the back of the room. Hold on, I'll type this all up. I gotta make my cell bigger. Hold on 1 second. Okay. I voted affirmative for grounded relationality being good and worthwhile. I think for me, I filtered this decision through the 2NR alternative as a pick out of relationality, meaning that if I think the relationality is good or has a net benefit, then that probably means that, and I think that that benefit outweighs the pick, then I would vote for relationality, which means I would vote affirmative. I think that the reason or the 2 advantages to relationality, I think there are 2 for me. First, I think grounded relationality provides a way of suspending exceptionalism for theoretical reasons and defines way to work/talk to define new relationships. The reason I don't think the Brady link argument takes this out is because I think this argument, as well as the 2 examples on the case page, demonstrate a relationality defined through humanity, sociality, etc., or community. Whereas I think the grounded relationality described in the Tuck as well as the Bird evidence is one that is animated, fostered, and nourished specifically through the land's own agency, outside of humanity being this like antiquated or humanity being like important. Right, it's outside of this like humanistic category, which I think is a different means of producing relationality. The second, I think, is essentially an impact term to sequencing, if I would like call it something, but basically that papering over or picking one antagonism over another, opposed to picking the permutation, which posits the clearing or genocide of indigenous folks, as well as slavery as both twin antagonisms as the language of the 2AR, because it makes one liberal multiculturalism is papering over indigenous genocide and allowing for that to occur, because you call it a rules or analogy or liberal multiculturalism because it assumes that indigenous folks have access to sovereignty, which I think that they've won a pretty decent argument about why that's untrue. And that there is no like access to this liberal access voids of humanism. It's just a void that of nothingness that indigenous folks also don't have access to. And I think the perm can act as a very simple corrective, or grounded relationality can act as a very simple corrective to that. So I don't have to pick papering over one or the other when I can pick both as the optimal option. The other link argument that I think I considered was the re-highlighting of the Tuck evidence that was in the 2NR, or it's flagged in the 2NR, but I don't think that this does enough to answer the reading of the Tuck evidence or just the rest of the evidence discussing Blackness and its capacity to have geographies. I think, sure, Black folks are ungeographic in the master settler sovereign kind of way, but not in a way that recognizes or that does not recognize humanity and recognizes the agency or the agential capacity of the land. I think that there are 3 things that you can do differently to get my ballot. The first one is rules of analogy / twin antagonisms, or that language. This is a lot of the language of the 1AR and the 2AR, and I think that maybe this could be a way to discuss / differentiate on the link debate. I think that requires you to answer some of the arguments I talked about earlier, i.e. the void and their take or critique of your take on sovereignty being like control of the land or the ability to have had control over the land. But I think identifying why trying to draw those lines of equivalence between the event horizon of slavery and clearing is an accurate analytic. Of course, again, you have to still answer that offense from before, but there needs to be some way of showing why these antagonisms are not co-constitutive with one another, which by the end of the debate, I'm not 100% convinced that they aren't. Number 2 is the land. The second thing is the land. I don't think that there's not a lot of lip service given to the negatives analytics or / response or analytics response to the affirmatives questions about the land / how it views the land. I think going for slavery potentially overdetermines those relationships to the land could produce relationality, could be a good way of going about this in the 2NR. I think that this is a bit in the block, but I don't think that this is really in the 2NR at all. I think like this is just a portion of the link debate that I don't think is really extended. I think instead you go more for like some of the stuff about access to relationships based on other movements, which I think that they're firmly not defending any of that stuff because their argument is about viewing sovereignty and viewing the land as like not necessarily even like something that we own or something, but it's like a part of that party or like a medium or another person that like necessarily controls and animates those relationships or those conversations. But I think like for example, slaves would make there's like an example that I could think of like slavery over determining our ability to have grounded relationality would be like bottle trees. It's 8 o'clock. Bottle trees, like how sometimes slaves would make bottle trees as like a spiritual reference and then slave owners would cut them down. So like how that can destroy the possibility of having that relationship to the land. Maybe that can give just some context and help. But I just think that their grounded relationality portion or like the offense they're going for is just like so dependent on a position or just taking a position on the land. And like this seems to be like a central tenet of their theory. And this is shown by like how in cross-sects you just keep like bringing it up and posing and asking like, what do you think about the land? And so I just think that there needs to be a larger push here from the 2NR. And then finally is the suspend exceptionalism argument or the Leroy like reading. I actually think Jared was onto something in the first cross-sects because he asked the question that was like, if we suspend exceptionalism, how do we ensure that anti-Blackness doesn't occur within those conversations? This is a really good question, but I think that line of argumentation like dries up, particularly in context of this discussion. But I think this argument could give context to like some of the coalition's arguments and like how even when we use grounded relationality, those arguments or those relationships still succumb to anti-Blackness or still allow for anti-Blackness to be generated, don't provide protections, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that could apply to the permutation as well as the ask. I think the rereading, because I think you go more for the rereading of the evidence, not really the argument that I'm imposing just now, or I was talking about just now. I think the rereading of the evidence probably just flows affirmative because all it does is say that like essentially like indigenous studies in the past have exceptionalized and the implications of their exceptionalism. And that's what their argument is that like both sides, both Black studies and indigenous studies both exceptionalize. And so like we need to just suspend all of that and just have like instead of thinking about theory, have like a real conversation. And I think that maybe thinking about like what happens in those real conversations and how they implicated how there's no protections in those conversations could be a really good way of thinking about rejecting that necessity to suspend exceptionalism or why that exceptionalism is important. But I think that just imposing the rereading doesn't do anything to like challenge their imposition of like, this is a reason why they get permutations. Because I think like another like portion is like the like you don't get perms kind of argument, which first I think the implication for that is like A, education and B, severance. I don't think it's severance. I don't think the permutation is severance. I think the permutation is the AF because they're defending grounded relationality, like nothing distinct from what their evidence has kind of been throughout the debate. Even the examples kind of stay the same throughout the debate. And then on the education portion, I just think that this Leroy evidence does a lot for them in that category without them being explicitly like now the education portion of why we get perms. Just like the education portion is that when we think about theory in this way, particularly amongst these fields of study, it leads to exceptionalism where we don't really get to the crux of, it's ahistorical. It doesn't talk to all the history or encapsulate all the history. And it means that we really don't get anywhere in these conversations to challenge Black and Indigenous relationality. But yeah, I think that's it for me. Again, this was a phenomenal debate, excellent scholarship. I'm super, super impressed.
I'm gonna try to just pick up rather than going over the same links and stuff, but half of those were compelling to me, especially the suspended exceptionalism conversation. I think the challenge for the 2NR in this debate is two different choices, whether or not to focus on the notion of can these theories be combined in a successful way, or instead go for a notion that the theories are fraught and there's always going to be a risk of anti-Black violence, and how do those two theoretical presumptions come together in terms of the accepted nation of the theory. The notion of the dis to the perm and the re-highlighting give me pause, but I ultimately come down on the same point that I think that both the Leroy evidence and the notion of the AF as having a way out of settler fascism gives them enough, and I'm not going to say a lot of solvency. I kind of disagree with my friend and good Judge Murphy that I didn't think they were winning as much solvency, but does certainly give them some part of a solvency story. I also think that they're spending much more time on this differentiation between grounded relationality and relationality that left me with some pause as to the terms. I thought their evidence was dealing with that as well. And so I would have liked to have seen more time on kind of that top of the debate, because I thought that you were already winning kind of some headway on the notion of them being unethical, but I don't see necessarily a notion of, if we know that these two scholarships are destined to have challenge, and if we know that we need to possibly get past that in order to combine them, should we risk combining them or not, despite the notions of that happening on unethical ground? And I think that they do enough and have enough of a consistent advocacy to kind of push that forward. Cal, are either of you seniors? Okay. Thank you for your process and your incredible debate skills and all the things that you have added to this. We appreciate all that you all have done in that regard. And I will stop there for now.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Cal State, amazing debate. Yeah.
Good luck, y'all.
Congratulations and good luck to UCM.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, y'all.